Hi, this is David Clemmons. It's Monday, and this is your 11th grade U.S. AP History class, and this is the second part of the Chapter 4 notes that I'm publishing for you guys today. And we're going to start today with the Mid-Century Challenge, Roman numeral 4, War, Trade, and Social Conflict, and go all the way to the end of the chapter. I'm just trying to put these things together so you guys have the benefit of what I have to share about these notes and stuff that we'll look at heading into the test on Wednesday. So, key events here: the British War against the French in America, the surge in trade, increased American debt to the British, and an increase in westward migration led to violence and rebellion. Okay? So, here we go. Albany Congress and the onset of war. An intercolonial Congress held at Albany in the spring of 1754 to meet with the Iroquois and redress grievances. Ben Franklin presented a plan for colonial union, the so-called Albany Plan of Union. This is the first time the colonies began to talk about the need to act as one group. Now, they've been colonies since 1607 with the beginning with Jamestown. Now, it's almost 150 years since the founding of Jamestown. That's the first time they're having a conversation about acting as one group. Okay? The guidelines were as follows: a chief executive that would be the commander-in-chief and administer laws. Sounds like us today. A legislature would pass laws. Sounds like us today. The Union would have the power to raise soldiers, build forts, levy taxes, regulate Indian trade, purchase land from Indians, and supervise Western settlement. Sounds like our government today a little bit too. The Crown, as well as each colonial legislature, would have to accept this plan, and Parliament would have to consent. Every colony rejected Franklin's plan, though, most with little debate. So, the Board of Trade launched its own plan with less authority for legislature by the winter of 1754-1755. The idea of a colonial union was a dead issue on both sides of the Atlantic. How ironic about that. The Albany Congress did encourage the Crown to take charge of relations with all Western Indians. So that's an important thing to know right there. Moving over to page 8 on the war begins. In the previous wars, the colonies were involved in the fighting, and it actually began in Europe and then came to the Americas. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, began in the colonies and began to spread to Europe. So, from the British point of view, the French provoked the war by building a string of forts in the Ohio River Valley. A young Virginia militia colonel named Colonel George Washington was sent with a group of militia to stop the work at Fort Duquesne, now modern-day Pittsburgh. Now, that's what was being built by the French. After an initial success, Washington and his men were routed and marched home in defeat on July 3rd, 1754. Now, this was the event that started the French and Indian War. All right? Now, the big difference is from Britain, it started in the colonies. They had to come rescue us from the French. All previous wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and the War for Jenkins' Ear / the 7 Years' War, or the, not 7 Years' War, King George's War, those wars all started in Europe and came to America, so they couldn't blame us for that. This one they blame us for and kind of want to charge us for a portion of it. Not the whole thing, but for a little bit of it. Okay? Britain's years of defeat. At the beginning, the war did not go well for the British at the beginning. Okay? Weather, malnutrition, and disease all took their toll on the British Army. Another expedition to attack Fort Duquesne under British General Edward Braddock in 1755 ended in disastrous defeat. George Washington went along as a colonial militia advisor. Attempts to invade French Canada in 1756 and 57 failed miserably. Algonquin allies of the French ravaged the frontier settlements from western Pennsylvania to North Carolina. Now things are pretty tense in England because they're losing the war. There were tensions between Loudon and Pitt, the prime ministers, from one to the other. Tensions between British officers and colonial soldiers, especially their officers, such as George Washington. After assuming power in London in 1757, William Pitt replaced coercion in the colonies to help win by gaining the consent of the colonies. Early in the war, they tried to force the colonies to help in certain ways. Pitt takes that away and doesn't do that. What he does is he says, hey, Virginia gave this much money, or brought this many supplies. Hey, South Carolina's doing this much and everything. What can you do, North Carolina? What can you do, Massachusetts? And competing against one another, the colonies tried to do more, and they became much more effective. 1758, the British had finally put together a military force capable of overwhelming New France and had learned how to use it. In the last years of the conflict, cooperation between redcoats and provincials, meaning the colonials, became routine and devastatingly effective. Years of British victory. British and colonial governments came to terms with the Western Indians in 1758. Peace with Indians permitted the British to move against New France. In 1758, the British retake Louisbourg from the French. In 1759, General James Wolfe led the British to capture Quebec. After the fall of Quebec in 1760, Montreal was taken, and French Canada surrendered and now belonged to the British. So, woohoo! By 1760, the British have control of Canada. All right? Now, a world war. Reluctant to antagonize Britain, Spain remained neutral for most of the war, a decision that had huge implications for North America. Spain's neutrality meant southern colonies were not threatened from Florida, so Britain could concentrate its resources against New France in the north. When Spain finally entered the war in 1762 in a desperate attempt at the end to keep the British from winning, France had already surrendered Canada to the British. The war hawks win. British statesman William Pitt and Lord Halifax in England wanted a war in North America with the French. Fighting began in June 1755, expanded the war to Europe in 1756, with Britain vowing to destroy France's ability to compete economically. So now it's moved to Europe. Pitt directed the war successfully from England, controlling both the commercial and military strategies. British had stunning successes and acquired Cuba and the Philippines from Spain, French Senegal, Martinique, and Guadeloupe eventually returned to France. The Treaty of Paris 1763 ended the war, gave Britain control over half of North America, including French Canada. Wow! Okay. Now let's look at number 6, the aftermath of the war, Pontiac's Rebellion. Okay. Now, part of Pontiac's Rebellion came about when the promised British goods that they were supposed to bring to the Indians did not come. And then when it did come, it wasn't as much as they had promised. So Pontiac and Native American rebels. British acquisitions in North America frightened the Native American population, who believed that they would lose more territory to Anglo-American migrants. Native Americans were inspired by a Delaware prophet, Neolin. The Ottawa chief Pontiac, with a group of loosely affiliated tribes, launched an uprising against the British. So they start that. Though Pontiac's rebellion was put down, the proclamation of 1763 prohibited white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This edict was largely ignored by the colonists. Now, one of the things that happens is that after Pontiac's rebellion, the British want to close the borders, essentially, and say, colonists, you can't move west of the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. And that's going to be a problem for the colonists, because they thought, hey, what do we fight the war for except to get this new territory? Okay. British industrial growth, Roman numeral 5, and the Consumer Revolution. Resources. Since 1700, Britain had become the dominant commercial power in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. By 1750, it was also the first nation to use manufacturing technology and work discipline to expand output. Mechanical power was the key to Britain's Industrial Revolution. There are many ways that they got that mechanical power, through water and other things. Artisans designed and built water mills and steam engines that powered a wide variety of machines, lathes for shaping wood, jennies and looms for spinning and weaving textiles. Incredible. Okay? Also hammers for iron forging. All right. Last things on the last page 10. Number 2, American consumers. Soon Americans were purchasing 30% of all British exports. To pay for British manufacturers, mainland colonists exported rice, tobacco, indigo, and wheat. So we're sending them staple crops. Okay? New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia supplied wheat to Europeans. The profits from exports enabled colonists to buy goods from England. Americans became more dependent on overseas credit and markets. The struggle for land in the East. Land disputes. Letter D. Land disputes. Rising population of the colonies meant more land needed. Disputes over land and tenant uprising broke out in the Hudson River Valley of New York, in New Jersey, and in some other southern colonies. Courts favored wealthy landowners. Increasingly, the landless moved west to the Appalachian Mountain region. Some moved across the Appalachian Mountain region against the will of the British and going past the proclamation line. Western rebels and regulators. Now, these are two groups, one in South Carolina and one in North Carolina. Okay, so this is important to know. All right, that the South Carolina regulators are this, and they're two separate groups, even though they're both called regulators. Okay, during the 7 Years' War, Anglo and Scottish settlers in South Carolina clashed with the Cherokee. The so-called regulators were vigilante landowners who demanded that South Carolina's Eastern Control government provide the Western districts with more courts, fair taxation, and greater representation in the Assembly for those who had settled the region. The South Carolina regulators, though, were unsuccessful in gaining power from the Eastern elite. Now, the second group of regulators, it's going to be more trouble. It's in North Carolina, civil strife in North Carolina. In 1766, several years later, a significant economic crisis in North Carolina came about as tobacco prices fell. To avoid losing their land, mobs of farmers, also called regulators, closed the courts and intimidated judges. The regulators proposed a series of reforms, including legislation to lower their legal fees and taxes. In May of 1771, North Carolina's royal governor sought to suppress the rebellion. Violence ensued, ending with 30 men dead and 7 regulator leaders executed. So 2 movements, one in South Carolina, one in North Carolina, both called regulators, but called regulators for different reasons. Okay? So that is all we need to do for Chapter 4. If you have any questions tonight or tomorrow, please send me an email, david.clemmons@kelwinic.net. So now you have the information you need to study for that test on Chapter 3 and 4.